So I'm Tyler Fortunati. I am DEQ's on-site wastewater coordinator. For those of you that don't know, I guess, who we are, we're not really out in the field, so for installers you don't see too much of us. But DEQ is the agency that maintains the rules related to subsurface sewage disposal and also maintains the technical guidance manual that you're using for any of the alternative system installations that you do. So I am a resource for not only the health districts but the installers and the general public as well. So I am available to answer questions if you have them. I do kind of put the asterisk next to that, though, that if you're calling about a specific permit or installation that you're doing, I'm usually I'll try to answer your question to the best of my ability, but I'm probably going to refer you back to the health district or at least be in contact with them to let them know that I've been in touch with you and what's going on. So on the bottom of the screen here, I do have a website, a web link there. That's the web link for the technical guidance manual, and that's what they've asked me to discuss today, is some of the updates that we've done over the last year. So that web link there is something you should know or be aware of, maybe bookmark on your computer, and it'll follow us through here on the next couple slides. I'm not sure how big it'll be, but it'll also be at the end of the presentation too. So I'll go ahead and just get started. Just to start with here, I want to go over the manual itself on how to get the updates and how to track what we're doing in the technical guidance committee with the manual. So you can all hear me too, by the way, right? Yeah, okay. So just to start with, it is the installer and the inspector's responsibility to remain up to date on any of the manual changes that occur, any of the updates or new sections that we put into that manual. And it's highly recommended, especially for the installers, that you own and maintain an up-to-date TGM and have that out in the field while you're doing an installation. Most of the inspectors are going to have that with them already. But as an installer, that's an important document. Any questions you may have related to the system you're installing, probably a majority of them can be answered by that manual if you know how to use it, where to find that information. It does contain a section of the rules as well for subsurface sewage disposal. So, get familiar with the manual and remain up to date on it. To be up to date on what we're doing out there, because that manual does change fairly frequently, you've got basically two options. It's up to you on which way you go, but you can either frequently visit our website on your own, so just remember to click on the link and check it out and see what we've been up to. The easier way that I recommend is subscribing to the manual itself. So on our webpage, and I'll show you how to do that, we do have a link that you can click on. A little box pops up and you can enter your name and email address, and then anytime we post an update to the manual, minutes for our technical guidance committee meeting or an agenda for one of those technical guidance committee meetings, you'll get an email in your inbox telling you what we're doing and letting you know that stuff's out there. So it reminds you to go check it out. That's probably the easiest way. So this is our website. For you guys, I'm not sure where it's at. I think the top left-hand corner there. There's the little subscribe to this page link. That's the link you click, enter your name, email address. When you do that, you'll only get updates related to this web page. So I promise you won't end up with spam. We don't sell your email address, and we're not going to send you a bunch of emails related to other DEQ programs that you don't care about. So strictly for the technical guidance manual. If you're interested in some of our other programs, we do have those links on other web pages as well. And then down at the bottom, I've also got the little accordion link, is what they call that, the updates to the manual there. That's where all the individual updates do get posted. Above that, in the middle of the page, there's a little blue PDF link, and that's the actual manual itself. So anytime we post an update, an individual update to the manual, the entire manual also gets updated. So if you click on that updates to the manual link, you get a drop-down list. This is kind of an older screenshot here from November. But what you see there is what you'll get for any update in the future. It just provides the section number of the TGM that was updated, gives a real brief explanation of what that section was updated for, and it gives you the page numbers. So you can see the little blue page numbers after that. If you click on that, you can pull up just the 2 or 3 or whatever pages that got updated related to that section and print that off instead of printing the entire manual, because that whole manual is somewhere around 270 pages. So We do meet quarterly and we update quarterly, so if you're printing that 4 times a year, it gets to be a lot of paper and a lot of ink. So know that that's there, and that's where you can go to get those individual updates. You know, you can also, if you got a smartphone or something, you can download the PDF of the actual entire manual and just utilize that off your phone. If you save it to your phone's memory, whatever it's got, you know, then you can access that whether you have service or not. So that's an option for you. Real quick here, this is the entire list of all the sections that we updated or added in 2013. So you can see we were pretty busy last year. In the hour I have today, there's no way I'm going to be able to go over every single one of those updates. So I'm not going to attempt to cram every single one of those in. I will go over a few of them here. If you have some specific questions on ones that are listed here that we don't go over, you know, feel free to ask when we get done with the presentation. And real quick for 2014, this is what we've been up to so far. We did meet in February. That was the first meeting of the year. So there were 2 updates that just got posted, I think last week. That was the entrenched sand filter in the easement section of the technical guidance manual. And we gave preliminary approval to like 11 different sections as well, and I'll discuss what that preliminary approval means. So come June, there'll be a whole lot of more final updates. I can't promise you every single one you see listed as preliminary will get finalized in that time frame, but a good number will, and we'll probably have additional sections that are getting introduced for revision at that time as well. So you know, stay up to date on what we're doing, kind of track where we're at with the updates. And I'll give you some reasons why. Revisions for that manual can get proposed in a multitude of ways. Either DEQ, typically my position or maybe one of my supervisors asks that we amend a certain section of the TGM or add a section of that technical guidance manual. It could be one of the members of the committee, so we do have a committee that oversees all these changes. So they may propose one of these, you know, a section to be updated, ask me to draft it. So my position, I chair the committee. It's my responsibility to draft all these changes and updates and then bring them to the committee for their review, and they may alter them at that point in time. But you can also, revisions to the manual can also occur through, you know, suggestions that come to me through the health district staff. Could come from an installer, an engineer, or the general public. So don't feel like you're not limited. Your input does matter. People using the manual, we want your input, you know, the more the better. If we get feedback, that's great. The committee does get it. I do present any feedback I get to the committee, and you know, it's up to them on what they do with it from there. But you know, I can promise you, you will be heard if you have some suggestions for us. So if we've got a drafted revision or addition to the technical guidance manual, what happens is that update gets presented to the technical guidance committee for preliminary review. So that may result in a revision of that document. They could give it preliminary approval. They may table it, so we might not do anything with it. We may do some more research or amendments with that section, or they could reject the change if they felt like it. During that period, public comment on the proposal, you know, is something that we look for. We rarely get. But there is always an opportunity at every technical guidance committee meeting for public comment periods. So, you know, when I say stay up to date on not only just the revisions we're doing, but the minutes and the agendas that we're putting out for those meetings, those all contain the proposed revisions. You can look at it word for word, see what we're striking out, see what we may be adding. And if you have a comment on that, you know, the earlier you get it to us, the better. Once we put it in there for after final approval, you know, we can go back and revise it, but it takes that 2-meeting cycle, so you're 6 months out before any change occurs to that manual after that point. So the earlier we get the comment, the better, and we do welcome that input. So if that drafted revision that comes up for preliminary review receives that approval, what we do is then post it to the DEQ website. So if you miss the meeting and you don't comment on it, but we do give that preliminary approval, it does get posted to our website for public comment, and we do send out notifications for that. They rarely get picked up by news agencies, but it is posted to those web pages for their ability to pick it up and print it. But anytime we're posting minutes for those meetings, it also contains the information that, it's preliminary review and it's going out for public comment. So at that time, you can submit written comments to me by email or letter if you want, or you can give me a phone call and I'll write down what your comment may be, and we'll present those to the committee at the next meeting when they're reviewing it for final approval. And those comments can result in some potential revisions. So again, your participation is definitely welcome. And we will listen to it. After we go through that public comment period, the document gets represented to the TGC for final approval. So that's within 90 days. We meet quarterly, so every 3 months. The TGC will consider any public comment. Again, there's still that public comment period during the meeting as well, so you can always, speak your mind there too if you don't get in a written comment before the meeting. They can suggest further revisions when they're reviewing it for the second time, so we can go through multiple rounds of revisions on any document. They can table it, or they can give it final approval. If they do give it final approval, we try to get that stuff incorporated into the TGM and posted online within about a month of the meeting. So it takes us a little bit of time to get everything together and run it through all of our IT technical editing departments and get it posted, but we do try to stick to that 1 month deadline. When we do post it, an update to the TGM, we do send an email to all the webpage subscribers, informing them of the updates, and then for the health districts and the DEQ regional office staff and the technical guidance committee themselves, I send out a memo to those entities and they get informed that way of those updates as well. So we're making sure the health districts are up to date on it that way, and then it's kind of up to the districts on how they disseminate that through their staff. But if you're subscribed to the webpage, you'll catch it shortly after that memo comes out. So that's kind of a real brief rundown on how we go through updating the technical guidance manual. So one of the first sections I really want to talk about today was the easement section of the manual. So we're going to kind of start out with some administrative type stuff, some of the stuff that goes in with the application process that your clients may be doing, or if you're filling that stuff out for them, stuff that you're going to need to include with particular applications. So with the easement section, that one underwent a pretty big revision this last year, and we've changed how that process works for the most part. Anytime that a septic system is going to be placed on a parcel that doesn't contain the wastewater generating structure, so maybe a neighboring parcel that you own, or maybe it's your neighbor's property, his farm field, whatever it may be that you're putting this system on, you do have to have an easement in place prior to the health district issuing the septic permit for that property. And that's regardless of ownership. So I could own both parcels, or it could be two independent parties that own both parcels. Either way, we're still doing a easement. The reason we're going to do it if I own both parcels is because nothing stops the districts or DEQ. We have no control over whether that parcel transfers hands. So, and we're not going to know when that does occur. So if the parcel transfers hands, you sell it to somebody else, they can come in, and if the easement's not in place, they're basically allowed to cut and cap your drain field if they want to. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. That can obviously cause issues because there's a reason we went with an easement, and it's probably because your property won't support a septic system by itself due to whatever the issue may be, setback concerns or poor soils or whatever the issue is. So to get an easement, that's the applicant's responsibility. They need to perform or provide legal documents that relate to the access to that particular system on the neighboring parcel. That comes in as part of the application, and that's what the actual easement accomplishes. It provides that legal access and restricts some activities with that related to that area of land. So again, it's got to be, the easement has to be in place prior to permit issuance. And you do have to have an easement for each property that's impacted. So if you're putting your drain field 2 or 3 parcels away, you have to have an easement that, for every single parcel that wastewater system is going to cross, whether it's just a transport pipe or the septic tank or whatever it may be. So every parcel that's impacted has to have an easement. As part of that easement, the applicants need to make sure that it contains a sufficient description of the easement area and the property benefited. that easement contains language that the applicant or any other property owner has access to the system for repairs and maintenance until that system's abandoned for whatever reason, whether that's connection to sewer or installation of a system in another area. Maybe they've figured something out for their own parcel potentially. So that easement also has to contain language that restricts the use of the easement in ways that impact the system's functions. So if my neighbor has a dump truck, he can't use the easement area and park his dump truck on top of my drain field. Things like that gets restricted. And the applicant needs to make sure that that easement gets surveyed, and that survey needs to include the monumenting of the corners of the entire easement area. So that's something that's new in terms of requiring that easement's surveyed every time, and that's prior to the permit being issued. And that survey will probably provide you with the legal, the description of the easement area. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to know, you said that you have to monument the thing before the permit is issued, but what if you get out there and realize that there's issues with the topography or rock and you've got to change the shape of that, and you got to go back and monument it again?
Hopefully you've worked that out beforehand. So, I mean, you don't just go get the easement and then come to the district. You should submit the application and have the district out to actually review that area. So they should come out and do a site evaluation of where you think this easement's going to go before you actually go obtain the easement for it. Otherwise, you might be wasting your time and your money, obviously, for a situation like that. So they'd look at it and you'd have all those issues potentially worked out before you actually went out to go get that easement recorded and surveyed and all of that. So the purpose of surveying it beforehand relates to one, knowing exactly where that easement lies, having it marked out, and so that the installer knows where that system needs to be put inside that easement area. You may have a general idea of where the easement lays, but if you show up and pop a trench into the middle of it and don't take into account the replacement area or whatever, you can screw up the easement. Usually those things are kind of dialed into the exact foot of how much room you're going to need for a primary and a replacement area. So that's why they're requiring the surveying ahead of time.
So are you surveying the actual parcel or the actual septic?
The easement. So they're going to have a certain dedicated square footage of property for that septic system placement, and they're going to survey the corners of that, kind of like they would an actual lot, but you just kind of think of it as the lot inside the lot. So
does the health district go over the easement then?
In terms of?
Well, before the permit's issued.
They do. That's kind of the bottom point on this slide here. They're not really there to determine the legal adequacy of the easement. That's another one of the big changes that occurred. And that was based on input from the Attorney General's office. The health districts shouldn't be responsible for reviewing that for the legal,
The thing is though, how's it going to get caught if no one's, because I've installed some of them, and the homeowner takes care of the easement, it goes to the health district, and I put it in, and
if you've got a permit,
no idea.
yeah, if you've got a permit moving forward, you should, the easement will be there. It's ultimately the applicant's responsibility to obtain the easement, not the installers. When you're out there doing test holes before there's an easement in place, they should also have permission from that property owner before they're digging on their property or any of that. But the easement, the permit won't get issued without the easement at this point in time. So
all you gotta do is have the property surveyed, basically, the square footage.
you have to have the property surveyed, but you also have to have the easement in place. So that's part of what the district's going to be looking at. So they're ensuring that the easement's been prepared by an attorney. So it's not just something that the applicant writes on a napkin. The attorneys are going to write it up, and that's how we're determining what the legal adequacy of the easement is, in terms of the language. And that the easement's recorded with the county. So they're going to look at those two things. They may be looking for the survey to make sure the survey's been done or whatever. But they're not looking at that and saying, well, this sentence here doesn't fit in with what we're trying to do. As long as the general language lines up with what we're trying to do and doesn't conflict with anything we're requiring, they're going to go ahead and issue the permit. So. Another new thing that we're working on are restrictions related to easements. So These are 2 new bullet items, and there's a third that I'll discuss here, but if there's multiple easements that are made on a single property, and those easements are going to exceed 2,500 gallons per day cumulative flow, then each system needs to be designed as an LSAS, and an MP evaluation has to be performed for that property. So that's mainly going to be related to developers and subdivisions where they get a common lot, and they're going to put 15 lot septic systems on one giant common parcel. And that goes along with what the subsurface rules have as a definition for the large soil absorption systems, and that it covers an entire project. So it can be multiple different systems, and if all those systems are part of the same project and they exceed that 2,500 gallons per day flow, then it's a large soil absorption system. So at that point, the developer or the applicants have the decision to make of whether they combine that into one big LSAS, or they're going to leave it as individual systems for each property. Either way, all the drain fields get pressurized. There's 2 of them installed with a replacement area for a third, following the large soil absorption system rules.
Tyler, what about developments that were done, say, back in the 80s?
That, yeah, doesn't impact that stuff.
Okay, so there's
It's just,
date?
yeah, it's just stuff moving forward from
Okay.
here on out. We wouldn't expect you to run the MPs on those Loman lots or anything. We know a lot of those probably aren't going to pass, but they were approved back in the 70s, 80s. So it's just new easements that are being made. Easement boundaries that aren't adjacent to the grantee's property line need to meet the 5-foot separation distance between the septic system and the easement boundary. So basically, you have your property line setbacks. Those relate to your easement lines as well, the easement boundaries. With the exception of just the one easement line that your property actually shares with whatever that neighboring property is. So you can encroach on your own property line, but you have to maintain the 5-foot to the easement boundaries. So, and then a third one that we're working on, it got tabled at the last meeting, but there's also going to be some form of a restriction related to how many transport pipes you can put in a single easement and the way that those get placed in there. And the purpose for that is we've had a lot of those bundled in the past, and if you dig in, you may damage, somebody else's transport line. So the intent of that restriction will be to protect individual systems and their transport lines, but we're tabling it and trying to make that more consistent with how the wastewater program operates for larger collection systems as well. So that'll be something you see probably proposed at the next meeting.
Can I ask a good question?
Yeah.
So when you talk about that easement, you're talking about, this is just to relate to private easements, you're not talking about like in a subdivision where you have a utility easement?
No, we have nothing to do with utility
Okay.
easements, just the septic system easements. So yeah, we have nothing to do with the, anything to do with the utilities. So power, water, all that stuff's completely separate. The reason we've got kind of a more defined easement issue is that there's really not much in Idaho code or any of the rules that really discusses easements, even when you get into like the professional engineering and land surveyor rules. There's just nothing out there that says this is exactly what an easement, needs to contain in terms of language or, how it should be set up. It's really kind of it's up to the engineer and the designer. So we're trying to get some best management practices in there to kind of prevent problems we've had in the past. Any other questions on easements? All right, so the next section we're going to talk about is the vested rights section. This is something that got updated last year as well. This relates to, probably a lot of your clients that you run into with existing systems. You may be familiar with this in the terms of the, when people call it grandfathered or grandfathering, my property's grandfathered. Just so you're aware, there is no such thing as grandfathered or grandfathering in any of the Idaho rules or codes related to septic systems. So when somebody tells you their property's grandfathered, it's really not, but they may have a vested right. So that's the only thing that a property has in relation to what exists there, is a vested right. And we'll discuss what that means. Property owners do have a vested right to use, repair, or replace an existing system only on their lot. And there are restrictions to that. That doesn't just mean we're going to replace with whatever exists. It's going to be specific on certain circumstances and whatever the site conditions are. So With the vested right to use, repair, or replace an existing system, that system needs to be an existing system that was permitted if it was installed after 1974. It's not an illegal installation, so you can't put a system in on the weekend and call the district the next week and tell them you have a vested right system in the ground. It needs to be installed prior to 74 if there is no permit, and it can't be a system that's abandoned. An abandoned system, by definition in the subsurface rules, is any system that's ceased to receive black waste or wastewater due to the termination of those flows or diversion of them to another system. Yeah.
What about an older home that gets bulldozed and they want to build a new home there? The same
They would-
replacement rules still apply to the old system there?
Yeah, that's still a vested rights thing on the use of that existing system. It's up to the district on whether they would consider it an abandoned system and allow it to be used or not. There is no time frame related to abandoned systems, though, you know, we typically go with like a 1-year period that, you know, there hasn't been flows going to that system. But, you know, if it's evident that that thing's been abandoned and maybe it's one they know absolutely doesn't comply with the systems or the rules, and they might just call it a abandoned system or a failed system. We'll get to that definition too. But that's, you know, it's all, they all fall under this vested rights issue. So with the vested rights to use, it has to be a system that's not abandoned, and it has to be a system that's not failing. And just because something's not connected, the district may not call it an abandoned system, especially if they've got a decent permit record for it, but it's up to the district in each specific situation on how they're going to interpret that stuff. A system's considered failing if it doesn't meet the intent of the subsurface rules, if it fails to accept black waste or wastewater, or it discharges wastewater into the waters of the state or onto the ground surface. So it can't be a failing system. And the vested right to use also includes the remodeling of an existing structure. So, you know, you do have the vested right to use an existing system if you want to remodel, but that remodel can't exceed the design flow of that existing system. So your use has to be the same. And if you're going to expand the footprint of a home, you can't impact the reserve replacement area. So you always have to have room for a replacement. Just because you have a home, a property, and a system doesn't mean you have the right to do whatever you want. It's going to impact, you know, the future use of, or future installation and repair of that existing system. So you have to have a way to dispose of wastewater properly. The vested right to repair or replace. Any system with a vested right can be repaired or replaced upon that system's failure. You know, that comes with a couple caveats though. Any repair or replacement needs to meet the subsurface rules, or if not possible, it needs to meet the intent of the rules, and that's the rules that are written as is today, not the rules as is written back in 1970 when the house was built. What that basically means is, depending on the site conditions, it can require that a property owner installs an alternative system, and that could be a basic alternative system or a complex alternative system. So you could end up in situations with high groundwater, or you can't meet setbacks of surface water where you're requiring some form of engineering, pump chamber installations, or any other alternative design systems that would meet the intent or meet the rules. So understand that when you're out on a property. Not all your clients are going to be able to just replace it with what exists there. They may have to get into something a little more complex. No property has a vested right to install a replacement system that does not at least meet the intent of the rules. So the districts are going to work through that with the installers on each specific site, you know, scenario, and there's probably hundreds of them out there. So we can't go over all of them, but just understand that if you do have a failed system and the system's really old and it doesn't meet the rules, you're probably going to have to do some upgrades. So. And then we have unapproved systems. So this is a system that hasn't had a previous septic permit issued regardless of the system installation date. So it could be something that was installed before we actually issued permits in the subsurface program. So back in the 60s, you know, there were no, I believe, health district permits at that time. Even if they find some specific county permits or something, but the records of that stuff's going to be pretty sparse. Or it could be something that did have a permit issued and maybe it got installed and for some reason there was never any inspection performed. We do run across those every now and again. For whatever reason that does occur. So that would still be considered an unapproved system because there's been no inspection or approval of that system in the past. So use of an unapproved system requires that the system needs to become approved. If the applicant's proposing to add on or alter the structure in any way that's going to increase the wastewater flow from that structure, or construct what the soil type is to ensure that that system's adequately sized, and they're going to need to make sure it meets vertical separation distances from potential groundwater or limiting layers, impermeable limiting layers that you're running into. They may require that the tank gets pumped by a permitted pumper to verify the volume and the condition of that septic tank. So that's something that could potentially be required, most likely will be. And that system needs to be inspected by the health district while it's uncovered. So you don't just uncover it and tell them everything looked good. They've got to come out and look at the whole thing. That entire system needs to meet the current regulations and design requirements for that particular system if it's some sort of alternative system. And then the district has to issue a permit for it. So they're going to come out basically on an application and site evaluation and do all this previous work to verify what's been installed. If everything looks good, then they'll issue a permit for it and they'll fill out a final inspection form based on what they've looked at. If a section of that system or the whole system itself doesn't meet any of the current requirements, then whatever's out of compliance needs to be brought in compliance in accordance with what the district will issue for the septic permit. So if they come out and say the septic tank's good, but the drain field's not, the permit they'll issue will be for a new drain field, basically, the installation of a new drain field. Or maybe you need to just replace one leg or something like that of the drain field due to a separation distance issue. The permit may require that. If that system or any portion of it can't be brought into compliance, then the system gets abandoned and it gets replaced with the system that does meet the current requirements. So, is that all? Any questions on that stuff? Fairly straightforward. Another big section that we've added in this year is wastewater flows. So this is another part of the application, and this is something that's new. Basically, every system, every permit application that comes in, there has to be some form of projected wastewater flow associated with it. That's a subsurface rule requirement. The wastewater flows, when we talk about that, refers to the volume of wastewater that a structure is going to generate in gallons per day. So, with your typical homes, that's just the bedroom count that you're giving them on an application. For a commercial or industrial facility, that's not going to be the case. The flow estimate, as you know, is used to determine the minimum size of the septic tank and the drain field. Most projects are going to use the subsurface rules. I've got the citation up there on the bottom of the screen to determine the wastewater flows for that particular project. But some projects aren't going to be capable of doing that. I know there's no way you probably can read that, but this is the subsurface rule with the projected flows. So really it's more of an example of this is how big the table is and how many different scenarios we have for projected wastewater flows. You can tell there's not very many. So obviously this table doesn't cover every scenario or every business that may be proposed to go on a septic system. So we've got some limitations there. Another subsurface rule citation down there at the bottom one, does allow an applicant to propose wastewater flows through appropriate measures to adequately size a system. So this is what I want to get into today, and this is what section 3.3 of the TGM, which is the new section we added, addresses, and that's what those appropriate measures include when you're going to propose a wastewater flow to the health district on an application. It's appropriate, I guess, for an installer or the applicant to submit alternative wastewater data when a projected residential, commercial, or industrial project's not covered by the subsurface rules. Most of your residential projects are going to be covered unless there's some sort of mixed use with some sort of commercial development either attached to it or maybe somewhere else on the property and they're going to share a system. It's also appropriate, if the applicant feels that the daily wastewater flow projections for a commercial or industrial facility that are provided in the rule are going to be higher or lower than the actual daily peak wastewater use from the facility that they're proposing. So You know, if an applicant wants to increase their flows, you know, that's not something the district's probably gonna scrutinize too hard. They'll probably just accept you know, we're wanting to size this at a much higher rate than what you guys are saying we have to. But if you wanna go lower than what the subsurface rules allow, or there's no data at all, or information in the subsurface rules, then you have to go through this alternative process for proposing the flows. So what that includes with any commercial or industrial facility, there should be the submission of what's called a letter of intended use. This includes information on the type of establishment that's going to be served by that system, the nature and quantity of the wastewater that the system's going to receive, and documentation that the system's going to comply with the subsurface rules. All of that gets wrapped up into a pretty simple letter of intended use. You know, and with this letter, you may have some, you know, appendices to this thing that have the wastewater data if you're proposing alternative flows. So that may be something that you'll see, and we'll get into what needs to be included for that. Again, none of this is required for standard residential dwellings, so if it's just a 3-4 bedroom home, you don't have to go through this process. So that letter of intended use includes the description of any commercial or industrial process that occurs in a facility. You know, it's going to look at the type of business, including the processes occurring within it that produce and discharge wastewater. So you're going to have domestic uses, which is just your restrooms, hand sinks, drinking water fountains, break room, maybe showers potentially. And then you're going to have some form of commercial or industrial process, and whatever that process is may produce some sort of wastewater byproduct. That's what we're wanting some additional information on. You know, that letter of intended use needs to include the maximum number of employees and/or customers, if you're going to have those, that'll be in the facility at any given time. So that's, you know, basically the maximum amount of people in that building at any given time for the employees, and then how many customers are coming through in an entire day. You know, the most customers you'd expect to see in a day. We do ask that those numbers include current and future uses. You know, every business that goes into business isn't in business just to kind of stay stagnant. They're usually wanting to grow. So if we can get your future projected use, usually it's easier to roll that in on the front end of your project than come in later. You know, if you want to expand from 10 employees to 30 employees in the next 5 years, you're probably better off just planning for 30 now, is kind of the thought there. And we also need the estimated daily wastewater flow that's produced by those, you know, all the wastewater uses in the facility. And those flows need to be supported by the rules, or they're going to follow section 3.3.2 of the TGM, and that's where we get into how to get that alternative flow data, and that's referred to as empirical wastewater data. Along with that letter of intended use, if you are doing some sort of commercial or industrial discharge to that septic system, there needs to be a non-domestic wastewater application checklist that gets filled out. That's on DEQ's website. The districts are aware of where that's at. That needs to be completed for every non-residential facility that produces non-domestic wastewater. You know, the issue, I guess, with that is that the applicant's probably not going to be able to fill that out on their own. They're probably going to have some form of consultant because we're looking at the constituents of the wastewater that they're planning on discharging. So, you know, most applicants aren't going to know that themselves. They're probably going to have to go to some sort of engineer that is more familiar with wastewater treatment planning.
Describe non-residential facility? Is that an office?
No, it should probably read more non-domestic. So as long as the use is non-domestic, then it's then you have to do the wastewater application checklist. So again, those residential or domestic uses inside a industrial commercial facility are just your bathrooms, break rooms, showers, drinking water fountains, things like that. Doesn't include processed water. The empirical wastewater flow data needs to be collected from facilities that are similar to the one that's proposed for the septic permit application. So we want to see facilities that are basically the exact same thing you're planning on building when you're getting data. That data that you're getting, we're looking at the water usage of those facilities to be able to plan what their projected daily flows are going to be. So that data needs to come from a source that has some form of water meter. It could be an influent water meter on the drinking water system, and it could be an effluent water meter on the wastewater pipes. Most likely, you're gonna find the influent meters. I don't know of too many properties or jurisdictions that require an effluent meter. But those are out there, so if you're installing your own meters, that's an option for you. You must be able to get the data and provide daily, weekly, or monthly projections. So typically, you're gonna get a bulk monthly usage. As long as we know the units, we'll be able to convert that down to gallons per day at the district level and break it out into whatever that projection is going to be. And again, this is all based on the potable water use of the facility. So there are a couple things that we'll get into that you're going to want to consider on that. Evaluated facilities should be located in Idaho if possible. So if you're down here in South Idaho, you can get facilities in Coeur d'Alene or Eastern Idaho, that's fine. It doesn't have to be from your immediate area. If it's a unique facility, then you can use out-of-state data. We realize some uses there may not be that business existing in Idaho, or there may not be 3 of them. So, you might have to go out of state for some particular facilities. So, again, that data needs to be assigned to daily wastewater flow, and we're going to want to be able to break it out on a per unit basis. So that's going to be like employees, what's the flow per employee, per meals if you're a restaurant, visitors, depends on what the use is. And if the facility produces non-domestic wastewater, that characterization should be included with the data.
I'm just curious on the why located in Idaho, where that came from.
I think they're just looking for stuff that's similar to what's done around here.
Assuming that the new facility will be similar to.
Yeah, something somewhere else in the state. I think we've got a lot of different seasonality that you don't deal with in some other locations. So, if at all possible,
I was just
think they're
thinking
looking
from
for
the point of
Idaho.
view of Pocatello, right next to Montana.
Oh, yeah.
Probably shares more things with Montana or Wyoming than they do with Coeur d'Alene.
They may. It's really up to the district. It's a should be located in Idaho. I think it also relates to ease of access to that data or to the jurisdictions that are overseeing of the public water utility or whatever it may be. It's easier to get in contact with those people and work with them from a state agency level than it is from somebody that's out of state. They may not really care what you're trying to ask for. So just the relationships that are there. Data needs to represent the time of year that covers the facility's peak usage time frame. So that's kind of getting back at the thing I was mentioning earlier here, that the data does need to be devoid of irrigation flows if possible. So, when you're looking at a place on public water, there's a high likelihood that they're irrigating with that public water as well. So take that into account. You don't want to be counting irrigation flows. So you got to look at times of year when that irrigation isn't being utilized, November through February. Or try to find a facility where maybe they've got a dedicated irrigation line for that property. So keep that in mind when you do go get data. Otherwise, you can incredibly inflate your projections if you're using irrigation flows. And data does need to come from a minimum of 3 facilities of similar operations. So we don't want just one facility. We're looking for 3. That data needs to be provided in writing by the water system operator. And it should include the facility statistics that are pertinent to that flow estimation. And that's kind of that stuff I mentioned earlier, number of employees and so on. And that data should be obtained from the facility and provided to you in writing. So we're basically just looking for verification that those are actual numbers and not just something that's written down in a notebook and provided to the districts, so that it's actually factual. Again, water usage should be over a period applicable to peak water usage timeframes. So for like a golf course, obviously we're going to want summer flows because they're not going to be very busy in the wintertime. And then again, there's also another peak period in there with something like that where we'd probably only be looking at the days of Friday, Saturday, Sunday when they're going to be the busiest and averaging those days together. We're not going to look at Monday through Thursday when there's not very many people using the course. Otherwise, we're going to deflate those numbers. So we're looking for that peak average usage. And then the health district may have other information that they think is going to be necessary based on the proposal. So I always say before you go out and do some of these data collection activities, make sure you've contacted the district and you've worked with them. So they understand what you're doing for one, and you understand what they want. That way everybody's on the same page, and hopefully your time frames and efforts can be reduced. The data evaluation is always going to be conducted by the permitting health district. The health district does have the ability to discard any data that they feel is inadequate for assessment. So if they think that you've provided something that is incorrect, or maybe that data is skewed for some reason, it's got irrigation flows or whatever it may be, they may throw that data out and not utilize it. So that's why we're looking for 3 facilities. We want to make sure we've got enough data to actually perform the assessment. And it does come with the caveat that if you do submit data, it can result in daily flows that are less than what is projected by the rules or proposed by the applicant, or it can result in flows that are greater than what's provided in the rule or by the applicant. So it goes either way. Just because you submit data doesn't mean your flows are going to be less. Understand that. And again, just that asterisk, work with the health district prior to obtaining and submitting any data. Questions on that? All right. The next section I want to briefly cover here is in-tank pumps. This section was also updated early last year. In-tank pumps are typically, referred to as those like the vault chambers that we're dropping into a septic tank, and they're also used in external dosing tanks as well. So they're kind of lumped into one category. They are allowable when they're used in a dosing chamber for any situation, and what that means is basically a dosing chamber that's segregated from the septic tank, whether that's through the design, combo design where you have a septic tank up front with a baffle wall in the tank, not with the baffle in the middle of the tank, but the baffle at the top, so it's a normal septic tank, so basically an extra compartment that's a dosing chamber. Or the installation of a segregated dosing chamber after a septic tank. So you can use them in those situations. They are allowed to go into an actual septic tank if the daily design flow is less than 100 gallons per day. So you're basically looking at shop uses in those situations. And the one I don't have on there is if you come across a replacement situation where there's absolutely zero room to get in a new dosing chamber, which we'll run into those every so often. So in that case, an in-tank pump could also be used. But for any new installations, unless it's under 100 gallons per day, they're always going to go into a segregated dosing chamber. Those in-tank pumps do have to be placed in an approved pump vault. Those pump vaults are now listed in section 5.8 of the technical guidance manual. I think it used to be 5.7 until this last month, but the thing we've done there is that the pump vaults were lumped in with the dosing chambers. So we've created a new section, I think it's 5.3 for the dosing chambers, and then the in-tank pumps or the pump vaults are listed separately and they're on their own table. So that's section 5.8 of the TGM where you find those. So understand that we did make that change. If these things are used in a septic tank, they're limited to having a maximum dose of 120 gallons and a maximum pump rate of 30 gallons per minute. So that's making sure that you're not pumping too much effluent out and sucking scum through your in-tank pump inlets, or having too much of a velocity that you're sucking up sludge off the bottom of the tank as well. So basically trying to minimize the disturbance that we get in that tank. That's one of the issues with the in-tank pumps, is that the septic tank is undergoing constant flux and levels and agitation. So that's why the limitations to them. The septic tank does have to have 1 day's flow above the high level water alarm if you do put one of these into a septic tank, unless you use duplex pumps. And they do need to be installed according to all the manufacturer's recommendations.
On that, you mean as far as detention time, if something happened, or what do you mean by that?
With the 1 day's flow? Yeah, so in the single pump issues, they want 1 day's flow above that in case the pump burns out. You've got some storage time in there before you gotta pump the tank, or maybe you've got enough time to get that pump replaced or whatever it may be. So with in-tank pumps, we do have installation requirements. The pump vault inlets need to be set at 50% of the liquid volume. Pump vault needs to have a screen with 8-inch holes or slits or smaller, and that screen area needs to have a minimum area of 12 square feet. The installation of the in-tank pump can't interfere with the floats or alarms associated with the pump in that unit, and you do have to have those units removable for cleaning, so you have to be able to pull them out of the tank and clean them off. And that's just kind of the screenshot that you get there. That's kind of what those typical pump vault units look like when they're set into a septic tank. And this is out of the TGM, so. Questions on in-tank pumps? 10, we're down to 10. Okay, pump to drop box. This is a system that's used to lift effluent to a drain field when gravity transport's not possible. It does include a transport line that's pressurized, and pressurization is then lost at the drop box. And then the effluent moves through that drop box and enters the drain field under gravity flow. So again, this is when we're installing the drain field up and above the septic tank for whatever reason. These are allowable for drain fields that are less than 1,500 square feet. Anything over 1,500 square feet is always pressurized, so those drain fields always have pressurization throughout them. A drop box is required in this installation design. That can be either a distribution box or a drop box. Probably the best design would be with the drop box, if you can find one. There's not a lot of cement ones out there, but we do have the plastic drop boxes that are available. Yeah.
Clarify, if you have to have a drop box, if the drain field is a single lateral?
That's the idea, yeah. They're looking to break the pressurization on the transport line completely before it goes into the drain field. So
That's
yeah.
not a health district specific call? That's come up a couple times and it's kind of a gray.
It could be. I guess the committee's kind of thought on that is that the transition to a larger diameter pipe, like we have listed on the bottom here, doesn't replace that drop box. So I think they're looking to completely break the pressurization, even though larger diameter pipe, it technically does. I think they're worried about the distribution of the effluent going into the drain field at a higher rate, depending on the I guess, size of that drain field or whatever the situation may be. It could be, I guess, up to the districts ultimately. I mean, they're the ones inspecting it, so it's going to be up to them on whether they're going to allow it, But that's the committee's recommendations are that the drop boxes should be used, so.
What size drop boxes?
That's up to, there's really no list of approved drop boxes or distribution boxes in the state. They just have to be compatible with wastewater. So usually it's precast concrete or poly plastic, basically, wastewater grade plastic. I do have an example way back this way. That's a plastic one that could be used as a drop box or a distribution box. You probably can't see it, but there's about 6 different inlet heights or outlet heights on that thing along the sides, so you can set those elevation differences in the drop box. I'm not going to have time to get to it, but in serial distribution in that section of the TGM, there's a real good layout of what a drop box looks like in terms of where those inlet and outlet heights are, and that's it here. So there's that diagram from the TGM. It just shows the elevation differences on those effluent pipes. All the pressure components that go into a pump to drop box system need to be designed in accordance with the pressure distribution section of the TGM. So that includes your pump selection, pressure transport line design, dosing volume, and the use of a dosing chamber. So pump to drop boxes do require a dosing chamber. Basically anything where there's pressurization through transport or pressurization of the drain field, all of the design comes from section 420 of the TGM.
Now that's new, isn't it?
No, not really.
Really?
Not according to what I've been told. It's probably new in the way it's written, but it's not new in the intent of how they thought it was being applied. So that's kind of the thought there. You're talking in terms of the use of the dosing chamber, or
Well, the whole thing.
just the design of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the design of it's not, when you're just doing a standard one, unless you have to get an engineer involved, which we'll talk about when that happens, but it's usually just designed by whoever's got the plug-and-play pump selection, software. Whoever your distributor is, they're going to give you the pump and probably give you your pipe size or whatever. You put it in.
General off the rim, back up to the good soils.
Yeah, exactly. When you do enter the drop box with your transport line, it should be angled to the bottom of the box, and that transport line should terminate above the high water level in that drop box. And you do have to have a complex installer's permit to do a pump to drop box system. And then, we just kind of briefly touched on it, but the selection of the pump and design of a transport pipe may need to be performed by an engineer if the elevation gains are greater than 100 feet or if the pressure transport line length is greater than 500 feet. So either of those criteria trigger requirements of engineering. And that is new. That's something that came in last year. That's one of the big changes. That's what a typical system looks like, pump to drop box. That's in section 420 of the TGM, so you can find it there. Really briefly wanted to touch on septic tank conversions to lift stations. This is something we run into. It's not an update we did to the manual, but it's something we're seeing a lot of through permit reviews. You run into these when the septic tank's installed deep, so usually if there's a basement or something and there's gravity flowing out of it, you may run into situations where you do have to lift the effluent to a higher level based on limiting site conditions. You need to understand as installers that the conversion of that septic tank to a lift station does require a permit from the plumbing division, from the Department of Building Safety, and you're also going to need an electrical permit from them. The plumbing division inspects basically everything up to that new septic tank. So when you do this, you install convert the septic tank to a lift station and it lifts up to a new septic tank, and then you gravity flow out of that tank to the drain field is the way they're set up. So you do have to have a plumbing permit, and I do know that the plumbing department will not perform the plumbing inspection unless the electrical inspection's been performed already. So they won't look at those components unless the electrical's been signed off. And due to other issues we've had, understand that unless you hold an electrical license, you're not allowed to do electrical installations in the state of Idaho. So you do have to have an electrical installer's permit. The septic installer permits we issue, you do not cover electrical installations. Ideally, this isn't exactly how we'd like to do it. If you do run into this situation, I think the preferable design would be to install a dosing chamber that's rated to be buried at whatever depth that septic tank is and lift to a new drain field. We know we can't require that, but that is probably the best practice due to the issues that you're causing with the wastewater using a lift station like that. So if you can't do that, I know that sometimes those tanks are hard to find that have those deep bury depths approved for them, or the cost may drive the property owner into wanting to just convert to a lift station. Know that when you do that, you are mixing up that wastewater. You're grinding everything up and sucking it out and pushing it out into the new septic tank. You're not going to get the same settling that you did when all that wastewater entered the septic tank under gravity flow from the house. So if you do this, it's a good practice to place an effluent filter on the outlet of that new septic tank. It's also recommended that you use a 2-compartment septic tank if possible to help settle that sewage out. And if you can talk your applicant into it, oversize the septic tank as well so you can get some extra retention time in that tank. And then the big thing that the inspectors and the installers need to understand too is that when you do this, the plumbing code doesn't require certain dosing volumes. Their code basically allows any lift station to fill up to within 2 inches of the top of that lift station until the pump kicks on, and when the pump kicks on, it voids the entire lift station. So if you've just converted a 1,000-gallon septic tank to a lift station and you don't adjust floats, you're going to dose 1,000 gallons to the drain field all at once. So if you do that, it's recommended to adjust the floats, take the daily design flow from the septic permit, divide it by 4, and set your float to dose at that volume. All the new literature says the smaller doses and more frequent doses are preferred over one large dose every day. So you can spread it out like that. That's the best design, but definitely adjust it so you don't void 1,000 gallons at once. So I think that's all I got time for today.